Hello, everyone, and welcome to Algorithms and AI Artificial Intelligence, the Future of Communication. I'm Dr. Jessica Eise, and this lecture is part of a short course. And my goals are to help you develop the ability to work intelligently in digital environments and to stay on the vanguard of communication innovation. So in our first three lectures, we discussed and reviewed the foundations of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and we took a broad look at AI's influence on communication. In our last two lectures, we discussed how artificial intelligence technologies influence media and also organizational communication. And in today's lecture, we're going to discuss how artificial intelligence technologies influence and impact interpersonal communication, which delves into a lot of very thought-provoking considerations, which tie together many themes we've covered so far, and really sets the stage for our next lecture, which is the future of communication in a world of increasing artificial intelligence technologies. So let's get started. Let's take a look at what is interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication is communication between two individuals, two people, and how their relationships affect communication and how communication affects their relationship. Interpersonal communication is centered on relationships between two humans, one-to-one communication between people who are interdependent and have some knowledge of each other. This can be friends, families, colleagues. It includes you and me right now, and how I communicate directly to you and how you give me feedback on this lecture based on your questions, comments, facial expressions, for instance. Because this lecture is virtual, I can't rely on as many in-person feedback indicators as I would prefer to, such as being able to more easily observe your eye contact and your body language in detail. All right, so are you asking yourself, how does this type of communication have anything to do with artificial intelligence technologies? Good, because it has so much to do with AI technologies, both in terms of impact of AI technologies on interpersonal communication, also artificial intelligence technologies and their limitations with interpersonal communication, and whether interpersonal communication can ever actually truly occur between an artificial intelligence-driven machine and a human being. All right, so before delving any deeper, let's break down just very quickly the process of interpersonal communication. This is important as we move forward and delve into AI technologies in this realm. So what you see here is the process of interpersonal communication as it is generally accepted amongst most major communication theories in this realm. So the two large blue bubbles, right, one on each side, represent two human beings as they are sending message via various channels. And they are also constantly receiving feedback by which they adjust their messages. In this way, relationships between two individuals evolve. Okay, let's break down these terms a little bit more. So the source receiver, these two bubbles, this is kind of the dual role of a person as both the source of ideas and then the receiver of other person's ideas. Messages are the way in which messages are conveyed. So the words that are used, tone, gestures, emoticons, videos, because this can now occur in digital environments. Feedback are the cues that indicate how your messages are being received. The channel is the method of exchange, such as face-to-face or like this, a digital, right, a virtual video, or the written word, etc. Noise is very interesting. So noise is the outside, noise is that bubble right in the middle that kind of emanates outwards, seeps into everything. It's the outside or internal distractions that can be actual noise or inner chatter in our brains that kind of get in the way or distort messages. And then context is the environment that influences the forms and types of communication. Okay, let's pull away from the PowerPoint for a minute and talk about what this means and what this implies. So in an earlier class discussion, we discussed the enormous complexity of human communication, how children from their youngest days are being taught to communicate by people around them in society. So think of a little kid and we say hello, we chirp, right? Dile hola. Can you say thank you? Dile gracias. And then not half an hour later, one of our classmates' young relatives popped onto the screen and we heard her say naturally, almost as a reflex to the little one, dile hola, say hi, right? So we train and are trained on how to communicate for years. We are taught context, how to read facial expressions, body language, cultural indicators, what words to use, what words to omit, how to subtly convey displeasure, how to say one thing while meaning another. We use these skills to build the important life-giving ties of relationships with human beings around us. We are innately social creatures. It is literally wired into our DNA. We rely upon our relationships to keep us secure, and we require these relationships to keep our stress levels low and to feel safe because we can survive in groups. Loneliness is a true affliction. We are not wired as human beings to be alone. In fact, loneliness can even feel akin to torture. It can be felt in the body, right? We need one another to care for us to stay alive. We depend upon each other. And we use this incredibly complex process of communication to build and cultivate the meaningful ties that we need with those around us in order to stay alive, happy, and healthy, to feel loved, to feel fulfilled, to feel challenged. The study of interpersonal communication also deals heavily with how to overcome problems or challenges that disrupt or distort communication flows, such as power differences, age differences, whether someone is considered in-group, right, or considered out-group, whether you see someone as one of you or whether you see someone as an outsider. It deals with intercultural differences, socioeconomic differences, religious differences. All these things influence interpersonal communication. And to become really good at interpersonal communication, we must be able to assess another person, to try and understand their background, to use our reasoning and our empathy and observations to draw conclusions about who they are. So even with these sophisticated brains that have received years and decades of training in communication, right? With brains that contain vast repositories of knowledge to contextualize, to rapidly read visual cues, we still make massive mistakes. We regularly misread people. People continue to have preconceived notions of who I am, right? And I'm often shocked to discover, and they are often shocked to discover that I'm very different from what they expected. And my external indicators give away certain hints, right? I'm light-skinned and I have pretty light hair, pero qué sorpresa descubrir que hablo español. What a surprise to find I speak Spanish. That I look the way I do, but I have a PhD in specialized training in computational methodologies, that I teach artificial intelligence, right? If it's hard for us with our sophisticated brains and our advanced reasoning functions, with our empathy and our eyes trained to observe micro expressions, with our noses cued to stress and pheromones, with our skins attuned to touch, how extremely hard for an algorithm to read these cues with their superficial systems guided by logic functions, coded by a small team of human programmers. Let's keep this in mind as we progress through this lecture, as we look at these three areas I mentioned earlier, which are the impact of AI technologies on interpersonal communication, AI technology limitations with interpersonal communication, and ultimately whether interpersonal communication can ever actually truly occur between an AI-driven machine and a human being. We'll look at some concrete examples in a minute, but let's talk more generally, just briefly, about how artificial intelligence-driven technologies have already altered people's comfort with interpersonal communication. Prior to the emergence of digital technologies and artificial intelligence technologies, interpersonal communication occurred almost exclusively in person, or perhaps via a handwritten letter, or maybe even on the telephone, but you had to talk, right? Consistently and from young ages, we were forced to interact with other human beings regularly. And this regular and consistent in-person communication cultivated deep relationships, sophisticated communication processes, increased empathy. It's an important concept, empathy, and we will talk about that later. Today, so much interpersonal communication has transitioned online. A lot of previous interpersonal communication that happened in person was erased. And this has caused many young people, and even many not so young people, to feel uncomfortable or nervous with in-person interactions. They may express their preference to use digital means of communication, such as texting, rather than having to interact. I'll express a personal commentary here and say, what a shame, right? Because the richness of in-person human interaction with all its intricacies and potential is really one of our most extraordinary capacities as human beings, and the most effective way to build a deep relationship. Right? But I reveal myself as a communication scholar. Okay, let's jump back to our slides and look at some concrete examples. Okay. We will look at just a few. So let's start with dating apps, of course. Romantic relationships are very important to people's lives. Very important interpersonal communication. Certain dating apps use artificial intelligence technologies to scan people's profiles and match them. For instance, some dating apps will scan your reported income and your reported morals in order to match you with people who align. I think we can all agree that reported income and alleged reported morals on a dating site are generally pretty poor indicators that sparks are going to fly, right? So what about chemistry? What about ability to make eye contact? What about the myriad of other factors that make two people like each other? It's interesting to think about what this means, having artificial intelligence technologies curate your potential romantic connections based on indicators that maybe might not indicate very much after all, right? Let's look at some other areas though, right? So college application reviews and job application reviews. These are tremendously personal and high-stake moments of communication in which you try to build a relationship with the college admissions staff or your future potential boss through a personal essay or a cover letter. Right? This is where you might hope that the nuance and subtlety of your message or an unexpected story might catch the eye of a person with whom it might resonate. But many of these processes today are run by artificial intelligence technologies that scan essays and applications, looking for certain words or word combinations or other programmed cues. Okay. Another fascinating way AI technologies impact interpersonal communication are through text message or email message reply recommender systems. Okay, these systems are trained on large groups of people who are similar to you, but also partially trained to your text messages, texting. But if something is recommended, it narrows your communication possibilities because it's drawing on something that happened before. So it removes the thought, the sophistication, the chance to improvise, to say something tailored, to say something new for the ease of a quick automated response. And what does that do to our interpersonal communication, right? Social media, right? This is an extremely interesting twist on interpersonal communication because you have all these hundreds of connections that are meant to be friends or acquaintances or at least potential friends. And the way that people communicate on social media is much less about sending personal messages, but somehow emitting these broad messages on content to all of your contacts at once. Okay, so think about it like this. Did we used to go around with like a big stack of flyers, just like handing them out to everybody we know, right? That's actually kind of what we're doing with social media, right? We're just handing out this broad message, right? And the curious thing about this approach to interpersonal communication, because you are communicating with these people with whom you're having a relationship, is that we don't really get the same type of receiver feedback. So we may get likes and comments, but many more people see a post than like it. So if they don't like it, like if they don't agree with what you posted, you won't get that feedback in most cases. And if they do like it, but they don't comment or like it, then you won't know that either. We also don't know if likes are really genuine or they're just like a gut reflex. We just don't know in many cases. And responses are far from sophisticated. Like if you just finished a major life milestone, you may get congratulations, right? But you might not get any sort of questions like, how was your experience? What does it feel like to be on the other side? What are you the most proud of? And on these self-same social media platforms, as we discussed in a previous lecture, artificial intelligence-driven algorithms tailor our social media feeds to show us things that they predict already interest us, or that we already agree with and like, therefore keeping us engaged longer on the website. But what does that do to our ability to maintain interpersonal relationships or to evolve as interpersonal communicators? What does that do to our ability to hear diverging opinions that we don't agree with, to be exposed to topics that we wouldn't otherwise be exposed to? In many ways, it seems like today's artificial intelligence technologies might be making our interpersonal communication, the way in which we build and maintain relationships one-on-one with other humans, narrower and perhaps more shallow. Because the algorithms themselves that influence interpersonal communication are, quite frankly, still relatively narrow and shallow. And we can't know how that will change. So let's look at AI technology's limitations with interpersonal communication. As you may have observed so far, I don't think that they've advanced very far, nor have they served us very much with the interpersonal communication we need to build deep, complex relationships with each other. This technology, AI, it is still relatively very new, even though it has existed, well, as we talked about, the definition of AI continues to change and evolve as the technology progresses, right? So it has, this concept has existed for decades, but it does continue to evolve. Still relatively new, but it's also in part because of the nature of an algorithm, as we talked about, a logic-driven function that's programmed to perform a task and executes that task based on a set of if A then B and if C then D functions. This is, of course, a very simplified description of AI, which contains very sophisticated algorithms, but the building blocks are the same, right? It receives input and it follows logic functions programmed into it, and it produces output. Even though machines can analyze far more data points than we can, at least right now, there's no replacing the human brain for understanding things that machines cannot measure or trace or observe. A particular expression, a particular word choice, a subtle body motion. There are subtle pieces of human communication that are extremely sophisticated, that rely on context, culture, and we don't even understand them all yet ourselves. So how do we train machines to observe them, to interpret them, to juxtapose them against other combinations that combine together to send a completely different message? How do we convey, for instance, how do we train a machine to observe subtle hurt, right? Or indicate to us if something that was said was insensitive? It's trying to take an incredibly rich process and boil it down into incredibly simple rules. Can we do it? I don't know. It seems unlikely. We do call it the art of conversation, after all. So, can artificial intelligence replace human communication? So, can interpersonal communication occur? Right now, as we accept it, interpersonal communication is between one human and another human. Can interpersonal communication extend to human and machine? Some people say they can. Some people believe they can. Some people are trying to make it so. Some claim they have already done that. Programmers are coding machines to mimic human behavior. Yet there are two crucial components that we must focus on, and that is that machines do not have the capacity to feel, nor do they have autonomous will. They can only be programmed to mimic feelings, and they can only be programmed to perform a function, even if that function is highly complex. But once that function is complete, it will cease to perform. Using artificial intelligence technologies, we can program machines to do an amazing job at mimicking emotions. And because human beings are highly empathetic, we may respond to these in a knee-jerk fashion. For instance, there are children's toys that are programmed to cry if they are mistreated. And these cries can cause true distress in human children, but they are not real. So let's pull away for a moment again and let's talk. This is a really critical and fascinating point to consider. Does it matter if it is real, or does it matter that people believe it is real? I think there's a lot to unpack in that space and a lot to consider very deeply. Programmed emotional responses in a machine that are not real versus emotions that are real, these are two different things, right? So human love, real love, is a powerful motivator driving our human will. A machine, no matter how sophisticated the artificial intelligence algorithm, does not feel. It does not feel love. It can mimic love because the lines of code developed by very talented programmers tell it to do so, right? Command it to do so. This inability to have will seems though that it can prevent spontaneous discovery, right? AI technologies can be highly sophisticated in running through various options and analyzing multiple inputs. They can do this with far higher volumes than the human mind can, but they can only analyze what they've been told to analyze. And through machine learning, they can train themselves to become more sophisticated at identifying certain responses that they were set to measure. But if they, for instance, come across someone from another culture who maybe doesn't use the same hand gesture as that North American they've been analyzing, then what? If the machine hasn't been programmed to account for cultural differences, then what does it do? And lastly, I said we would do this earlier. We'll come back to this issue of empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. It is what drives profound interpersonal communication, which forms the building blocks of relationships. Machines cannot feel, therefore they cannot share your feelings. Let's jump back to our slides here. Let's talk about some considerations, as always. Today, I'm just going to stick with one because I think I've raised enough considerations across this lecture. Technology, it doesn't go away. We don't go back in time. Inventions are not erased. Artificial intelligence technologies are here. And while this currently poses some challenges to interpersonal communication, going forward, it's going to depend on how we use it, how we develop it. We can use technology well, or we can use it poorly. It is a tool. So we can use artificial intelligence technologies with wisdom and foresight on how they will influence interpersonal communication, or we can use them without wisdom and foresight. We can educate ourselves on what it is doing to our interpersonal communication. We can try to find ways to change it, or we can sink into an apathetic abyss. Let's not do that. For instance, there may be some areas where artificial intelligence technologies can really facilitate basic interpersonal growth skills, interpersonal communication growth skills, toys or programs that can help children or maybe even immigrants to a new country learn and adapt to unfamiliar communication contexts. It can maybe help us learn languages. We could use actually they already are using artificial intelligence technologies to help capture and visualize interpersonal communication. For instance, they can even measure who is dominating a conversation, right? We could use artificial intelligence technologies to match lonely people together who are close by and need in-person company. So many of these already exist or are emerging right now. There are many ways we can use artificial intelligence technologies to serve as stepping stones to improved interpersonal communication. So let's look for those and let's work on those. All right. Thank you everyone, as always, for joining me. Our next lecture, our second to last, will be an interesting one, which is anticipating the future of artificial intelligence on communication.